This is KM Weiland, and you are listening to the 517th episode of the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast. This episode of Helping Writers Become Authors is brought to you in partnership with Podtone. If you're a podcaster who's struggling or unsure about your recording quality, or if you need help editing, mixing, or mastering your podcast, you can visit the team who works with me every week at podtone.com or drop them an email at info@podtone.com to get started today. Some of you have been asking, so I thought I'd give you a quick update on my progress with my soon-to-be-published book, Writing Your Stories Theme. Briefly, we're getting really close to publication. Yay! I'm halfway through proofreading, and we're working on cover design and formatting the paperback version right now. I still don't have a firm release date. A lot of that depends on how quickly the cover design is finalized. There's an outside chance, which I would totally love, that it will be published by October, just in time for NaNoWriMo prep. But that may be me being my usually overly optimistic self. At any rate, we're definitely on track to see it published before the end of the year. So stay tuned on that, and I'll let you know when we get close. And now, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Are you afraid to let anyone read your writing? Here are 5 steps for moving past fears. One of the best things about writing is being read. Unfortunately, that can also be one of the scariest things. When you're just starting out, it can feel like a huge jump to let someone else read your story for the first time. It feels like another jump to move past the eyes of kindly family and friends to asking strangers to read and comment on your writing. And even if you've been writing and publishing for many years, there may still be days when you're afraid to let anyone read your writing. I hear from quite a few young and or new authors who are experiencing anxiety about sharing their writing. Although most of us want to be read at some point, the writing itself often starts as a deeply personal exercise, sometimes not so far off from writing a dream journal. The characters and story scenarios we envision can often feel like veiled references to our innermost selves. Add to that the fact that writing and storytelling are complex skills that usually take years to fully develop, and we all fear looking like fools for sharing our burgeoning talents before we're quite certain they're up to snuff. And then there are the unfortunate experiences when we do drudge up the courage to share our stories with someone, only to have our vulnerability met with indifference or even soul-withering criticism. And yet, for most of us, the idea of never sharing our writing is almost more scary than facing down the world's critiques. At some point, most of us just have to take the jump and surrender our early writings to a reader or two. From there, we hopefully get enough encouragement to keep going through the inevitable barrage of blistering comments, well-meaning or not, which will slowly thicken our skins and help us confront our storytelling weaknesses on the way to writing better and better stories. So if you feel yourself preparing for that jump, or if you know a young writer who is, here are a few steps you can take to help you set yourself up for a successful and heartening debut. Step number 1, listen to your fears, acknowledge them, and understand them. Fear is one of the most potent feelings humans experience. It's a warning system designed fundamentally to keep us alive. And part of staying alive is communicating our worth to other humans while simultaneously either signaling that we're no threat to them or we're such a big threat that they better stand down for their own safety. Writing, especially writing a story, can seem relatively harmless, but it is still a communication with our fellow humans. And even though few of us are likely to come to actual harm from our writing these days, we are still in touch with the deep primal self that fears offending others or devaluing ourselves in their eyes. It is important to realize this. Your fears are not bad or even irrational per se. They exist for a reason, to guide you to the safest and most life-protecting choices. But fears are also not prophecies. Just because you're afraid of something does not mean that thing is actually a threat. And even if it is a threat, your best course of action won't always, or even often, be avoidance. So start by acknowledging your fears and the rationale behind them. Try not to identify with your fears. They are not you. They are just an alert system within your body. And whether you choose to fully heed them, hold them in a grateful space. Only once you can understand why you are afraid of something will you be able to come up with a successful plan of action to mitigate those fears. Step number 2. Wait until the timing is right. One reason you may initially be afraid to let anyone read your writing is that it's simply not time yet. Now, everyone's mileage varies a little on this, but in my experience, it's valuable to keep your writing just for yourself throughout an early incubation time. And this is not only true of the very first time you share any of your writing with anyone, but also for every story you write. My own preference is never to share a story with beta readers or critique partners until I've finished the first draft and polished it to my own standards. And when I'm satisfied I've made it the best I can by myself, then it's time to bring in objective outside opinions. Personal experience has taught me that when I share before this point, I not only risk potential discouragement during the most formative stages of a story, I also risk having my own vision for the story diluted by other people's desires and opinions. Now, not all writers work this way. Some do their best work sharing a chapter at a time. But it's important to get in touch with your own instincts and to discern what will best nurture your unique creative experience. Step number 3, get clear on why you're sharing your writing. Sometimes, even when we know a story isn't ready to be shared with anyone, we're still tempted because we crave the reassurance we think people might offer us. This doesn't always go the way we want, however. If the only reason you're sharing your writing with someone is so they'll tell you it's great, you have a 50-50 chance of being disappointed. A good rule of thumb to operate by is to never ask a question unless you're willing to hold space for either answer, the positive one or the negative one. Most writers are hungry for praise and affirmation. Sometimes it's hard for us to truly believe in the worth of our own stories until enough people have confirmed it for us. And that's a discussion all its own. But it's worth realizing that whatever particular motive we have for sharing our stories, that is probably what will be affirmed. If we share out of insecurity, it is probably our insecurity that will be affirmed. But if we share out of our courage, that is what will be strengthened in the long run. When you've reached a point on a story where you're confident in it and truly want someone's honest feedback, not just for strengthening your insecurities, but for strengthening your writing, then it's time to share. Step number 4, find the right readers. There are many types of readers. There are people who love us and want to affirm us and our writing. There are fellow writers and editors who know the craft and want to point out our writing weaknesses so we might improve. There are people who have lots of opinions, but no true understanding of storycraft. There are paying readers who want only to be entertained and don't care too much about our feelings if we let them down. There are inherently kind readers, and there are inherently cruel readers. There are people who know how to be constructive in their criticism, and people who don't. With a few obvious exceptions, there's a time and a purpose in seeking feedback from each of these groups. For instance, if you're particularly afraid to let anyone read your writing when you're just starting out, it's often wise to seek the kindest readers you can find. That may be your mom, or not, your best friend, or a helpful teacher. Regardless, if you can find someone who will cheer you on, this will help you discover the courage to seek out the more objective advice that will then help you face your weaknesses and improve. Now, it should be noted that if you are actively seeking feedback from a variety of sources, and you should be, you will inevitably run into a few readers from the undesirable groups. Developing a thick skin is just part of being a writer. The more experience you gain with criticism, the more skilled you become at eating the meat and spitting out the bones. And step number 5, learn how to respond to feedback, both good and bad. Perhaps one of the reasons writers struggle with the inner conflict between wanting and fearing to share our writing is because knowing how to respond to feedback is a tightrope act of its own. We must be open to feedback that points out our inevitable need to improve, while also realizing that someone else's negative opinion of our work doesn't invalidate it, and in fact may not even be an objective reflection of its worth. In the beginning, we may be inclined to take one of two extreme positions. Either we dismiss any criticism and insist our story is exactly how we want it to be, or we absorb every criticism in the belief that our readers know better than we do. The truth is somewhere in between. Indeed, gaining the experience to recognize your own particular balance between the two is a huge part of the learning curve for writers. What's important in the beginning is that you try to maintain a logical neutrality to any and all responses. When someone tells you the story is the best thing I've ever read, don't believe them. If someone else makes you feel you have no talent whatsoever, don't believe them either. Process through the emotions and then learn to criticize your criticisms. Why are these suggestions being made? Are they valid? Would making the suggested changes improve your story or not? Why? The more you learn about the craft and theory of writing, the more context you will have for analyzing your readers' responses. As this happens, you will find yourself having to rely less and less on the affirmation of others to understand the relative merit of your storytelling skills. When I first started writing novels, I was terrified to share them. I burned the first one. The next 4 were read only by my sister. And when I eventually published the 5th, 6th, and 7th, every negative critique or review felt like an invalidation of not just my writing skills, but my personhood. Time, experience, and a majority of positive responses have slowly mitigated my fear of sharing my writing. But even now, a particularly stinging review can sometimes momentarily make me feel like I want to hide all my writing in a big box under the bed. Learning to overcome our insecurities as writers is a process that cycles through our lives over and over again. Indeed, I rather think that the continuing presence of this fear means we are doing something right. It means we are writing on the jagged edge of ourselves, sharing our deepest human vulnerabilities, and pushing our skills to the limit. Write scared is what I always tell myself. But what I really mean is share scared. Share the stuff you're scared to share, but do it with consciousness, presence, and a plan of action so you can optimize your experiences and use them to push forward into getting your unique writings out to more and more people. Now, I hope you'll share your experience with this with me. Have you ever been afraid to let anyone read your writing? If you'd like to be part of the Word Player community over on my site and join in the conversation on this subject, be sure to stop by the website at helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. You can always find a transcript of the most recent podcast and add your voice to the discussion by visiting the first post on the site's homepage. And don't forget that if you're looking for an older post, you can always find those by putting the podcast title in the search field at the top of the right-hand column. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or whatever your favorite podcast platform may be. And if you'd like to support helping writers become authors, I would totally appreciate it if you consider taking the time to leave a quick rating or review on your site of choice. Thank you so much for listening to the Helping Writers Become Authors podcast, and be sure to check back again next week.